Alright, the Asus ROG Strix XG27ACDNG. If you guys want to check out this exact same monitor, there's Amazon links below for the US, UK, Canada, and international links, but let's talk about it because this one, well, it's really good. Obviously, this has a 27-inch screen size with a 2560 by 1440p resolution. The panel type here is a quantum dot OLED, and that's why it makes it so special, but also the tuning that Asus did here, well, that's the real reason why this is so special. This is the Gen 3 quantum dot layer manufactured by Samsung, so because it doesn't have a polarization layer in it, it does have some caveats. The one being, to get the deepest blacks possible, like you're expecting an OLED to have, you need to be in a dimmer or dark room. For the ports, this has one DisplayPort 1.4, two HDMI 2.1s, a USB Type-C with display capability, as well as 90 watts of charging. Additionally, this has a USB Type-B upstream, three USB 3.2 Type-A downstreams, and a 3.5mm audio out. Impressive ports here, but I really like that 90 watts of charging. That's a nice touch. For the refresh rate, this is 360 Hz, has FreeSync Premium Pro, which means HDR and variable refresh rate at the same time, and obviously this works very well with G-Sync. It is going to be a monitor that you're going to be using HDR in probably quite a lot. But now let's get into the meat and potatoes, the brightness here. Now, all OLEDs have what's called ABL. It's essentially where the brightness constantly fluctuates based on what's on the screen. If it's brighter, typically it'll decrease the backlight, and then if it's colors, it'll typically increase the backlight. However, monitors have varying amounts of ABL. Some it's barely even noticeable, others it's so unbelievably distracting that it ruins a monitor. However, there's some settings on this panel that make it so much brighter than I think any other OLED panel, well, I know, brighter than any OLED panel we've ever tested. In both SDR and HDR, disabling the setting called Auto Logo Brightness brought up the overall max brightness substantially. Now in SDR, before doing this, I tested this brightness as actually class leading, especially with this quantum dot OLED panel, 340 nits of brightness. That's really good already. But disabling Auto Logo Brightness brought it up to a whopping 405 nits of brightness. That's unbelievable. That's full screen brightness on a white screen. That's crazy. Not just this, but Asus has another setting that you turn off called Global Brightness Control. And this makes ABL, or the brightness constantly fluctuating based on what's on the screen, significantly less. And in that way, I mean that it doesn't dim it as much, so it maintains that max brightness more of the time. It still does ABL. When my colorimeter wasn't attached to the screen reading the data on this monitor, it wasn't super noticeable at all, and I might not have noticed it if I hadn't have turned that off and then been looking for it. Now in HDR, the story is the same here. Decreasing both of those settings still increases the brightness and lowers the effects of ABL. However, in HDR, the ability to change settings is one of the best in the whole industry. Most of the times when you're in HDR, your menu system will be locked out. You won't have a lot of controls. I'm not sure if I've ever had a monitor where you can actually change the brightness in HDR, but this one you can. To get there, you go into HDR and then you select adjustable HDR. This allows control of brightness, contrast, uniform brightness toggle, all OLED care toggles, and color temps, including full adjustable red, green, and blue values, saturation, and 6-axis saturation. Now in HDR, the colors are way under saturated, but if you just bump the saturation up by going into the adjustable HDR, it looks great. I turned mine up to 65, your panel may differ. As well as that, in HDR, I set my color temperature to 6500 kelvins, and while it's not actually 6500 kelvins, it was slightly off. I think it's within 250 kelvins, which is pretty good. Asus really slam dunked this monitor with the ability to let you control any of the settings that you want, and then the overall screen brightness is crazy for an OLED. All right, but let's talk colors now. They are amazing here, covering 99.3% of the DCI-P3 color gamut, which is amazing. The colors here look so good, and after changing those brightness settings, the colors pop as the image becomes even more vibrant due to the brightness increase, because even though the colors are still just, well, the same wide color gamut, the brightness behind that really brings out the vibrancy. And on an OLED, I haven't seen one this bright before, so mix that with the colors and it's an unbelievably beautiful experience. And then you still have 360 Hz and it's an OLED, so gaming performance is unbelievable here. Now, as far as color accuracy out of the box, it wasn't perfect, but it really wasn't that far off. Color temperature was pretty bang on, close to a 6500 Kelvin target. And saturation in SDR is great, but like I said, in HDR, turn it up. However, I really can't push enough that in-game this is jaw-droppingly beautiful because the brightness mixed with that super wide color gamut and the glossy finish is just unbelievable. It's so beautiful. Okay, but let's move on to text clarity because this is a QD-OLED Gen 3, so how is the text clarity? It's significantly improved, just like on the Alienware, but here they have a setting called Vivid Pixel. This setting makes small text significantly easier to read without affecting the picture quality outside of text. It does a really good job here. Because this is the Gen 3 panel, the actual text fringing itself, separation of green and red when looking at text because of the sub-pixel layout, it's not that bad here at all. And then mix that with the Vivid Pixel, it's a non-issue in my book. From a normal viewing distance, you really cannot notice anything wrong with the text. And that's, again, I have it pretty close. Some people may have it further away, so if you do have it any further away than I do, you're really not going to see anything, so that's great, non-issue. For response time and gameplay experience, let's talk about it. Obviously, because this is a borderline instant response time, ghosting, as you can see on screen, looks absolutely phenomenal. It's basically perfect, it's crystal clear. But for gameplay, you mix that with all of the things that I've talked about, and it's such a dream to game on, especially because this is cheaper than the Alienware AW2725DF, and those are the same panels, but this one, well, this panel is able to have a significantly higher brightness, especially when hopping in Forza Horizon 5 and you have light shining through the trees. It's so vibrant, it's so beautiful, and you have that brightness from an OLED. Now, a lot of these OLEDs, I've talked about it before, you don't actually need super high brightness because the highlights pop out. It creates a really dynamic effect. Mix that with the glossy finish and it looks wonderful. But high brightness on an OLED still looks absolutely phenomenal. It really brings those colors out like, well, I haven't seen on another OLED, which is kind of crazy because it's the same panel. I think that just shows how important tuning your OLED panel really is. But now let's talk about console compatibility. If you want to use this with a console, it's great for it. With both the PS5 and the Xbox Series X and S, this is capable of either downscaling a 4K 120Hz signal with HDR and variable refresh rate on at the same time, or 1440p at 120Hz with variable refresh rate on the Xboxes. And for the PS5, you get 1440p, 120Hz, variable refresh rate, and HDR. So the PS5 is fully compatible. The Xbox, we all know, in 1440p and 1080p, you cannot do HDR. If that gets updated in the future, this monitor will be able to do that. But now let's move on to flickering. People have talked about that as a problem on this specific 1440p 360Hz QD-OLED Gen 3 panel. That's a mouthful. But the flickering here for me was not an issue. However, everyone's eyes are different, but they do have a flicker-free or an anti-flicker mode. They have a medium and a high setting. I turned those on to test them. I didn't notice flickering before, so it was hard to test if it fixed the flickering, but I would assume that it's gonna at least help a little bit, but it would probably address it, yeah. But obviously I can't say that for certain. With that, let's talk about the menu system and controls, which I know you're gonna be like, that's boring. No, this is one of the best parts about this monitor. The controls here are great. This uses a little bump out on the chin of the monitor with a light up ROG logo, and the menu joystick is on the back, along with the two buttons for either power or input switching. This is a perfect location and it's very well thought out. The menu system is easy to use, the graphics aren't amazing, but at least they tried here to make it a little bit fancier. However, the settings are very easy to get to and find without any real learning curve, and there are tons of settings with enormous amounts of different controls that many monitors don't even allow you to do, especially in the OLED maintenance or the OLED care section. You can turn off and on all of those things and also adjust the frequency or the level, and that's a lot of stuff that you can play with. But again, even though there's so much here, it's not confusing, which is a very hard thing to do, or seemingly a very hard thing to do for a lot of manufacturers, but Asus nailed it. It's great. Now, for the stand and build quality functionally, I like this. It has good height, tilt, swivel, and full rotation, both to the left and right. However, the stand and the materials themselves, they look cheap. They don't feel cheap. It's still sturdy, but they just look cheap, and on the outside, it just is a cheaper plastic than something like the Alienware. For Vesa compatibility, this is compatible with 100mm by 100mm Vesa mounts, so if you don't want to use the stand, you can always mount this on a monitor arm. For RGB, there is a little bit on the back. It's not bright enough to shine against the wall in a dark room, but if you do see the back of your monitor, well, it looks very cool. But now the most important section of the video, price and value, and should you buy this? Well, this comes in at $799 and gives you more control over settings like ABL, HDR, and color settings while giving you significantly better brightness, so I definitely recommend this monitor as an absolutely enormous amount of value. Again, if you want to check out this exact same monitor, there's Amazon links below for the US, UK, Canada, and international links. This one caught me off guard. I did not expect it to be, well, so different from the Alienware that I reviewed, but it's really showed me just how much tuning has to do with OLEDs specifically. It seems like that's really big for OLEDs, which absolutely makes sense. This was Type C Tech Reviews, and I'll see you guys in the next video.